Jerome Harris had just moved into the upscale apartment complex in the heart of a thriving city. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where he could focus on his budding career as a graphic designer and escape the daily struggles of the lower-income neighborhoods he had grown up in. The building, with its pristine hallways and luxury amenities, was everything Jerome had hoped for. At least, that's what he thought. From the moment he signed the lease, something felt off. The leasing agent, a cold woman named Mrs. Carter, had given him strange looks, her forced smile disappearing the moment she saw his dark skin. But Jerome had ignored it. He didn't want to believe that racism could follow him into this fancy new life. A few weeks passed, and Jerome settled into a routine. He enjoyed quiet nights working on his freelance projects, occasionally heading to the gym in the building. It was peaceful until the complaints started. One night, as he was finishing up a project, he heard loud music thumping from the apartment above. He tried to ignore it, focusing on his work. But when the noise continued past midnight, Jerome had no choice but to call the building manager. His fingers hovered over the phone for a second. Maybe I shouldn't. I don't want to come off as complaining, but it was late and he had to work in the morning. He finally dialed the number. Hi, this is Jerome Harris in 305. I'm calling because the noise from the apartment above me is really loud. I don't want to be a bother, but I can't sleep. The manager, Mr. Wilkins, sighed audibly on the other end. All right, I'll send someone up. But we don't usually have problems with our tenants. The way he emphasized we sent a chill down Jerome's spine, but he brushed it off. The next day, Jerome was met with a cold reception from some of his neighbors. A white couple from down the hall looked at him as if he had done something wrong. Even the friendly old lady who often watered her plants by the entrance barely gave him a nod. A week later, another incident occurred. This time, the music wasn't coming from upstairs, but the shouting was unmistakable. Jerome heard someone banging on his door early in the morning. He rushed out of bed, groggy and confused. When he opened the door, Mrs. Carter stood there, flanked by two police officers. Mr. Harris, she started, with that icy smile back on her face. We've had multiple noise complaints about you. The tenants have mentioned hearing loud music and disturbances coming from your apartment late into the night. Jerome blinked. Wait, what? That's not true. I'm always quiet. If anything, I've been calling about noise from upstairs. The officers exchanged looks. Sir, we're going to need to come inside and check. Jerome, taken aback but wanting to prove his innocence, stepped aside. They walked in, inspecting his small but tidy apartment. There were no speakers, no signs of loud parties. Nothing. One of the officers glanced back at Mrs. Carter. Doesn't seem like there's much going on here. Mrs. Carter's smile faltered for a moment before she collected herself. Just make sure this doesn't happen again. Mr. Harris Jerome was left standing there, feeling as though something much deeper was happening. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't about noise at all. But what could he do? Jerome decided he had to meet the neighbor upstairs, the one who was causing all the noise in the first place. He wanted to settle things himself, peacefully. After all, this had to be a misunderstanding. He took the stairs up to the fourth floor, hesitating for a moment before knocking on the door of 405. A few seconds later, the door swung open, revealing a man in his mid-30s, wearing a stained tank top and holding a half-empty beer bottle. What do you want? The man slurred, barely able to keep his eyes open. Jerome took a deep breath. Hey, I live downstairs in 305. I've been hearing a lot of noise coming from here, and it's been tough to sleep. I just wanted to ask if you could maybe keep it down at night? The man stared at him, his face slowly twisting into an ugly smirk. Oh, you're the one who's been complaining. Figures. Let me guess. You think you don't belong here either, huh? Jerome's chest tightened. He could feel the rage building, but he swallowed it down. Look, I'm not trying to start anything. I just want some peace and quiet. The man leaned in closer. Maybe this building isn't the right fit for you. Maybe you should find a place where people like you belong. Jerome froze. His hands clenched into fists, but he stepped back. He didn't want to give this man the satisfaction of seeing him lose his cool. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his mind racing. Was it just this neighbor, or was the whole building out to get him? Days later, Jerome came home from work to find an eviction notice taped to his door. His heart sank as he ripped it down and read the words, "Repeated disturbances, failure to comply with building regulations." His blood boiled. This was insane. He hadn't done anything wrong. He stormed down to the manager's office where Mrs. Carter sat behind her desk, already anticipating his arrival. "Mrs. Carter, what the hell is this?" he shouted, throwing the notice on her desk. She looked up at him with that same cold smile. "Mr. Harris, we've had multiple complaints. The building has rules, and unfortunately, you violated them." Jerome shook his head, barely able to contain his anger. "This is racism, and you know it. I've done nothing but follow the rules while that man upstairs blasts music every night and harasses me." Mrs. Carter raised an eyebrow, unbothered. "Mr. Harris, I suggest you vacate the premises before this gets any more complicated." As he left the office, Jerome realized something wasn't right. This wasn't just about noise complaints. There was something deeper, something the building management was hiding. He knew he had to dig deeper, but he needed help. Jerome contacted a local civil rights lawyer, Mrs. Taylor, who had a reputation for taking on cases of racial discrimination. After hearing his story, she immediately agreed to help. "I've seen this before," she said, leaning forward in her chair. "It sounds like they're trying to push you out because they don't want people like you living there. But we're going to fight this." They began gathering evidence, recordings of the noise from upstairs, testimonies from the few neighbors who hadn't turned against him, and then they found it, the smoking gun. An anonymous tip led them to a former employee of the building management who revealed a dark secret. Apparently, the building had a history of forcing out black tenants using bogus noise complaints, all while covering for wealthier white residents who violated the rules. Even worse, some of the police officers who had shown up at Jerome's door were in on it, receiving kickbacks to ensure certain tenants were evicted. Armed with this evidence, Mrs. Taylor prepared a lawsuit against the building's management. Word spread quickly through the city, and soon enough, Jerome's case became a headline in local newspapers. But the real moment came when the trial began. Mrs. Carter, the manager, was called to the stand, her composed demeanor cracking as Mrs. Taylor presented the evidence. "You evicted Mr. Harris on the grounds of noise complaints, correct?" Mrs. Taylor asked, her voice calm but commanding. Mrs. Carter nodded, her face pale. "And yet, there are multiple recordings here showing that the real disturbances were coming from 405, a tenant who never received so much as a warning." Mrs. Carter stammered, but it was too late. The truth was out. The trial ended with a resounding victory for Jerome. The building management was fined, and the officers involved were put under investigation for corruption. Jerome not only won his case, but also became a local symbol of resilience against systemic racism. As he stood on the steps of the courthouse, reporters surrounding him, Jerome felt a sense of peace for the first time in months. He had fought back, not just for himself, but for every person who had been silenced by discrimination. The story wasn't just about noise complaints or eviction notices. It was about exposing the hidden racism that thrived in places where it was least expected. Jerome had won his battle, but the fight for justice continued.